It appears that a diabolical opponent is concealed behind the mask of globalism. Masquerading under the auspices and livery of liberalism is something darkly authoritarian. It's a sort of crushing ordinariness. It's a crushing mundanity. It's the crushing of the spirit, that your life is sort of trite and rote. And here you are, devour your gruel and stare at your sticky screen. Once you've extracted God, then they are God.
Welcome back to Rattlesnake TV, guys. In this video, we're going to be watching some of the highlights from Tucker Carlson's recent onstage interview with Russell Brand. In typical Russell Brand fashion, he blows the audience away here with some fantastic and pretty deep monologues, which we're going to get into in detail. So with that, let's get into the first bit about Russell Brand's awakening.
As becomes increasingly evident, we're no longer discussing trivial material, ideological or economic differences. We are discussing spiritual warfare and the necessity for absolute victory, the absolute necessity for absolute victory. And as we have to overcome the dead former person in each of us and transcend, the same must happen, I suppose, for our culture. It seems that we're at a critical point where sort of tweaks and measurements and levies and tariffs will be insufficient when it appears that a diabolical opponent is concealed behind the mask of globalism. This must be confronted in your country and in mine and across the world. Now, when did the awakening happen? And the awakening is continually happening, Tucker, isn't it? Because this is I suppose I will say this. When we have these conversations and you sort of say that you're from the right and like you've worked in legacy media all those years, and actually when I'm talking to like John Rich on a recent podcast that we chatted, me and John, I love John because I love his intensity. You look at him, he's like even now I can feel his eyes boring into me. You're not being Christian enough. I'm trying. This is as Christian as I can be. It's not good enough. I'm from England, so I don't know what goes on I don't understand your country. I don't understand anything. If it was I thought it was fantastic when Barack Obama became president of your country. I thought that's fantastic. Fort Lauderdale.
Just quickly, guys, a reminder that if you have not liked the video and if you're enjoying this content, then helps me out enormously if you do hit that thumbs up. And if you like it here, if you're getting value and all of that good stuff, you can subscribe to the channel. Back to it.
Because I thought, what a wonderful indication of the progress of this nation. 2008, you will recall that there was a terrible financial crash across the world and that the instigators of this economic nightmare, which continues to affect people not only in this country but across the world, ought to have led to a reckoning of financial systems, ought to have led to a reckoning of the type of elites that manage to maraud unseen behind visual government. If there is a power that is veiled, it is the power that goes unchecked when events like 2008 take place. I never would have considered myself a person that would have even conceived of voting for a Republican of any variety. For me, my memories of the Republican Party is like George Bush and Cheney and Iraq War and weapons of mass destruction and needless loss of lives of Americans and Iraqis and British people and people across the world as a result of those conflicts. We're now beyond partisanship. As I said last time we spoke, when Tulsi Gabbard and Bobby Kennedy joined the MAGA movement, it became clear to me that what we're dealing with is beyond the typical political taxonomies. This is indeed something deeper and more profound. I feel that there's a kind of attempt to mask in language, lies and words something very, very powerful, malfeasant and nefarious behind these bureaucracies that legislate and control, that curtail and limit, prohibit and break down institutions that seem sacred and timeless, ineffable, difficult to understand and impossible to decry. I never thought that we would reach a point where I'd find myself saying, in this election, something has to be done to disrupt what's happening. See me, so when you say like awakening, I've awoken from being a drug addict. I've awoken from thousands of obsessions and compulsions. And now what I've awoken from is the idea that people that talk about protecting the vulnerable have any concern other than the maintenance and exertion of further power. I think it's happening in my country. I think it's happening in your country. I think it's happening in France, in Canada, across the world, masquerading under the auspices and livery of liberalism is something darkly authoritarian, and anything that can disrupt it, prevent it, or stop it proceeding, I think is vital. So awakening, I think, is like an ongoing thing, Tucker.
So I've been following Russell Brand for a long time, and I feel some sort of a kinship with him just because we've had a very similar sort of political and spiritual arc, or awakening, if you will. And maybe some of you can also relate to this. And I know that his theatrical nature doesn't land with everybody, but he is a former thespian and very extroverted and an extremely gifted linguist, which is something that I really appreciate and enjoy. Anyways, the first time I ever became remotely politically conscious was in my early 20s, at a time when I went down the lefty route of hedonism and degeneracy and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I was anti-religion and anti-establishment, or so I thought, and I thought the big problem was rich people and that we need to strive for social justice, yada, yada. Until I started researching more, and then you've got Jordan Peterson who comes along and switched my mentality, and things started to really make sense for me. And this led me to the work of individuals such as Douglas Murray and Gad Saad and their books, and started watching Tim Pool's show a lot, and started watching The Daily Wire, until eventually I was completely convinced that they are definitely turning the frogs gay.
I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay. Do you understand that?
And it seems like Russell Brand had a very similar arc where he realized that being on the left is actually counterproductive when it comes to combating the issues of institutional power and corruption. Because social justice is merely used as a Trojan horse for very, very powerful people to promote and veil a sinister agenda. Think the World Economic Forum and their climate change initiatives, financial institutions with their insistence on DEI to control the entire global market, the transhumanist trans agenda with their need for affirming people's identities and saving the lives of all of these closeted trans children, BLM using racial justice to hide their Marxist agenda, Antifa fighting fascism, aka installing communism. Every single time you peek behind the veil of these social justice movements, there is always a sinister agenda behind it. And every single time it is about power and control, and they never ever have your best interests in mind. So on to the next part now, where Russell goes on a very compelling rant about the nature of modern totalitarianism or dystopianism, which I don't think is a word, but we're going to use it anyway. But it's very interesting, also very wordy. So let's have a listen, and then I'll do my best to break it down as I see it afterwards.
Well, you brought up the word dystopian. You know, I think in a lot of our minds, we read the book of Revelation and we envision what the world must look like when that book is playing out, and it looks like a apocalypse movie to us. But it won't look like that. It does not say that. It says, back to Noah, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the end times. And it says, in the days of Noah, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. They were going on with regular life. The world was not falling apart. It was just wicked. And Noah was living in the middle of that. So it's not going to look like some apocalypse movie before he comes back. It's going to be, they're not going to like us very much. Anybody that won't submit or bend to the will of this empire that's going to come up there, I think we're watching being built right now, they're not going to like us very much, but it's not going to look like some apocalypse movie. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And the truth is, and I'll stop, but the Lord wins. He wins in the end. He destroys all of them, and we win with him. So that's the victory. It happens at the end. You just have to go through the rut to get there.
Well, I like what John Rich just said, if I may tell you, Tucker, even though I know you were here and you're just there and he's there, look. It's like that. What I liked is John Rich was describing worldliness, mundanity, banality. And what I'm experiencing is the kind of banalization and desacralization of everything. You're right. It isn't like sort of some roaring and demonic hellscape. It's a sort of crushing ordinariness. It's a crushing mundanity. It's the crushing of the spirit, that your life is sort of trite and rote. And here you are, devour your gruel and stare at your sticky screen endlessly. Like, it's not even that dramatic or barbaric. You're right. It's the mechanical tedium of a global bureaucracy that sees everything as data, that would patent seeds, that would patent life itself, that would see ovaries as little more than a resource. All things mundial, literally of the world. Worldliness, the flesh, and the devil are the opponents that we must be aware of, John. You're right. And it is the tediousness, I suppose, that we must oppose through his glory.
I was taught to believe that when totalitarian government came, people would be marching through my town and I'd have to salute them. I didn't realize it would be like a heavyset middle-aged woman kind of scolding me about health.
We read a bit of George Orwell before, Tucker and I, and of course, if you think of the ongoing portrayal of Trump as a kind of throwback, as they continually say that he is a dystopic dictator and that he'll make himself president for life. But indeed, it is more these anodyne bureaucracies that are vividly portrayed in the writers, the Czech writer Franz Kafka's work, who talks about unknowable bureaucratic entities that can accuse you of stuff and you never know quite where it's coming from. Or Aldous Huxley, who writes not about dystopias, in fact, but utopias, where everything is one. Because the key thing is, of course, the replacement of God. Once you've extracted God, then they are God. Once you have denied people access to the divine, then you are free to replace God in their lives. You are free to issue new creeds. You are free to issue new dictums. And I thought it was very beautiful in that bit of Orwell from 1984 that we was reading, me and Tucker before, we was having a chat back there. But when it says that famous bit from George Orwell, when he talks about the dystopia that's being created, and he says, if you want to have an image, you'll know this line, because you're well-educated, beautiful people of Fort Lauderdale. If you want to imagine the future of humanity, says the leader or a mouthpiece of the dictatorship depicted in 1984. He says, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Now, that's not like the jackboot of the very real Nazis. It's the identity of the human face. In whose image were you made? In whose image were you made? If you can stamp out and grind out the God from man, then you are free to replace them. And what could be more diabolical, more Luciferian, more evil than that?
So lots of interesting references there that I'd like to dive into because we do love a good tangent. He speaks about the famous dystopian concepts put forward by Aldous Huxley and George Orwell, and which one is more relevant to the modern day, which I think they both are. And fun fact, actually, Aldous Huxley was George Orwell's French teacher at Eton College. Anyways, I mean, chapter 9 of 1984, when Winston reads Goldstein's The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, which I won't spoil for those of you who haven't read it, is a stunning read when done with modern context in mind. However, Huxley's Brave New World really strikes a chord because it's this world where government stifles individuality in children from a young age, and where the citizens are taught to love their slavery because they're provided with everything they need based on their condition, whilst they're sedated and numbed with the drug Soma, which suppresses any feelings of unhappiness, simultaneously suppressing the ability to be able to feel the highs and lows that make them human. When reading Brave New World with modern context in mind, i.e. Big Pharma, mainstream media, the education system, and how people will trust their government to no end, bending over backwards to do what they're told, to wear the mask, to take the shot, to stay locked inside, tell on your neighbors, etc., you really start to see the parallels. But the bit that I found really interesting about Russell's monologue there, and the bit that I'd like to expand on, is when he talks about the mundanity or the banality of totalitarianism, and especially how this relates to the modern world and how it conflicts with the typical vision of totalitarianism, which is the iron fist or the uniforms and the black steel-studded boots. Hannah Arendt, the 20th century political theorist, coined the intentionally paradoxical term and wrote the book The Banality of Evil. And whilst her work is more in the context of Nazi Germany, it still does map on. She talks about the banal and everyday nature of so many aspects of the Holocaust, and how seemingly there are just ordinary people doing ordinary things, doing paperwork, organizing the trains. And the optics of that are quite absurd and jarring when you really think about it. And it suggests that totalitarian evil is organized and lawful and essentially banal and bureaucratic. She says, quote, "The greater the bureaucratization of public life, the greater will be the attraction of violence. In a fully developed bureaucracy, there is no one left with whom one can argue, to whom one could present grievances, on whom the pressure of power could be exerted. Bureaucracy is the form of government in which everybody is deprived of political freedom, of the power to act. For the rule by nobody is not no rule. And where all are equally powerless, we have a tyranny without a tyrant." I mean, once again, with the modern context in mind, does it sound familiar? Furthermore, Russell also mentioned the German novelist Franz Kafka there. Kafka's theory on bureaucracy is that it's one of the most inefficient ways to run things. Through various novels and essays such as The Trial, he highlights the absurdity of bureaucracy and also the problem of distance, or the distance between you and those who control you. Quote, "Every revolution evaporates and leaves behind only the slime of new bureaucracy." And this kind of leads to my next point about bureaucracy being a late stage of empire. There's a book called Barbarians to Bureaucrats, which highlights the life cycle of a corporation, but also maps onto the life cycle of civilization. First, you have the vision created by the visionary, which is led forth by an iron-willed barbarian who is able to turn the vision into a material reality. This is followed by the builders and the explorers who expand and grow. But then creativity and innovation is stifled when the bureaucrats get involved and they put an overemphasis on rules and they overly implement order and regulation and make everything very hard to do, and they bloat the system. Think Washington, D.C. as a perfect example. And then this in turn invites rebellion. And as a civilization, I think we might be approaching the rebellion stage at the moment. Just for an example, think about how popular Donald Trump's notion of draining the swamp is. And also how popular Vivek Ramaswamy's ideas are about gutting the bureaucracy and firing 70% of federal employees. Or how effective it was when Elon Musk went in and fired 80% of his Twitter employees. I mean, from my vantage point, it's becoming increasingly clear that there is a bureaucratic tyranny that is running our societies, a tyranny without a tyrant. And they definitely don't exist to further our best interests. So guys, with that, don't forget to like the video by hitting that thumbs up down below. Subscribe to the channel if you're getting value from what I do here. And also, if you'd like to watch another one, right here. Till next time, I'm Jake. This is RattlesnakeTV, keeping you armed and dangerous.